Right, so my title this evening for this little presentation, first of all, I'll give you a little bit of background. I've been giving some talks recently in this period of semi-lockdown. We're not locked down in our school, but we have fewer pupils this year and the same number of teachers. So we have less work to do. And so I'm working up at the moment to a presentation of a doctorate sometime this year, and I'm getting homework to do. And one of the things that I'm having to do is to write a literature review about the curriculum. And I haven't done it yet, but some of the talks that I've been giving are working up to that. And you might remember seeing in history textbooks posters from the First or possibly the Second World War. What did you do in the war, Daddy? And so I thought I'd take that kind of question as a springboard to talk about what has been called the curriculum war, or the curriculum wars, which have been going on, as we'll see this evening, for about 4 or 5 centuries, but particularly in our Anglo-Saxon culture since the 1960s. So I've got quite a long story to tell, and I'll start it at the beginning. Over Plato's Academy, there was a sign, "Let none but geometers enter here." And in the 7th chapter of his Republic, an ideal education for philosopher kings is described. It includes what we term the trivium, the threefold path of the language arts, of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music being also poetry and dance and various things like that. So you might say it's the study of language, and then also the study of number, pure number in space, and then number in time. And then also we see the importance of athletics, the idea being that the body was the form of the soul, and that through an education that valued proportion and balance, hence the idea that only geometers were allowed to enter into his academy, the body would be prepared by athletic exercise to receive the education. It's a much later expression, mens sana in corpore sano, it's that sort of idea. And like our own education system, which seems to go on for a very long time, this education system also went on for a very long time, for elites. And it was distinct, at least in Athens, from military training, which happened alongside it, but it wasn't conflated with it. This education, such as it was, because of course in the 7th chapter of the Republic, it's an ideal education that's being explained, it was an education in virtue and in wisdom. It aimed at making free men achieve their full stature intellectually and physically, so that they might be fit to rule, or more likely to participate wisely in a democracy. It's interesting to note that the metaphysical musings of 5th and 4th century Athens were happening at about the same time as the wisdom writings of the Old Testament, and also various wisdom writings in ancient Egypt. A desire for a science of how to live the good life in tune with the heavens was in the air at the time. The Greeks would have given this a scientific explanation, an explanation that might well have been offered at any other time for the next 2,000 years, that there was something in the air. The demons or the muses or the angels were sending out their inspiration, perhaps in tandem with or at the behest of the Logos, perhaps because of a good alignment of certain celestial bodies. In short, the obvious scientific explanation, according to the science of the day, was that men were simply listening to the voice of God. In the catechetical school of Alexandria, which St. Jerome tells us was founded by St. Mark himself, Christian boys of all classes were given this kind of education: gymnastics, the trivium, and the quadrivium, and then if they stayed long enough, philosophy, and finally theology. This was the education then for a philosopher king, but it was given in Alexandria to the rich and poor alike, subsumed now and perfected by the Christian faith. The ancient worldview of Greek learning, as the ancient worldview at that time, was that Greek learning represented the most eminent, reasonable, and scientific way of thinking, based on skepticism and dialectic, questioning and research in pursuit of truth. The Greek attitude and Greek philosophy met Christian teaching head on, and the result was a brand new science, that of theology, and it proved a very fruitful meeting. By the time of Aquinas, theology was described as the queen of the sciences and philosophy its handmaid, and the whole intellectual edifice which supported this was the complete body of secular knowledge, so it was conceived, represented by the trivium and the quadrivium. The most striking consequence of the meeting of Athens and Jerusalem was that the human search for truth and wisdom now had a clear, higher moral purpose, a closer union with the one that St. Paul called the unknown God, because this God had now made himself known. And he said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." It's difficult to overemphasize the explosive effect in philosophical terms of the incarnation. The Greeks had moved from the study of the seen to the unseen, from physics to metaphysics, but now the unmover had himself moved. The invisible had become invisible, had become visible. He who was beyond physics, metaphysics, now made himself in his human flesh subject to its laws. And it was in the Greek world at Alexandria, in fact, that Greek learning came to the defense of the new orthodoxy when the Christians began to lose their nerve over the full divinity of Christ. And thus the full cosmically shattering impact of the incarnation. Here's the story of that defense of the full divinity of Christ in a brief summary. Born in 25 BC, Philo, the Jewish Hellenistic philosopher based also at Alexandria, was the first to attempt to reconcile Greek philosophy and Hebrew scripture. In ancient Greek thought, the logos, or the word, referred to a universal divine reason, immanent in nature, yet transcending it. This eternal and unchanging truth had been present from the time of creation and was still present to the seeker after wisdom. For Philo, the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament was the Logos, and it was this Logos which was God's instrument in the creation of the universe. His version of the word, the Logos, was a kind of demiurge, not quite a full God, but the closest we mortals could get. Philo, writing just a few years before St. Paul, wrote, "The Logos of the living God is the bond of everything, holding all things together and binding all the parts, and he prevents them from being dissolved and separated." And so St. Paul, who perhaps read Philo when he wrote to the Colossians, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for in him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions, or principalities or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." For Gnostic Christians, if you can call them Christians, the demiurge was the malicious God of the Old Testament, and Christ was the ambassador of the true God, God the Father. His coming, however, did not involve a real incarnation, and his bodily joys and sufferings were merely an illusion. This is the Gnostics. Because for the real God to get tangled up in matter created by the demiurge would have been a nonsense. The real God was unknowable, and there was no way to reach him. The Alexandrian school of theology squared the circle by emphasizing the full divinity of the Son, and with regard to his incarnation, the perfection of his two distinct natures, fully God and fully man. And the main figure of this work of theology was Origen, the father of systematic theology, really, who died in about 254 AD. Unfortunately, one of his disciples, Arius, also of Alexandria, backpedaled on the full divinity of the Son, and this was the background to the First Council of Nicaea in 325. And so Nicaea produced this piece of theology and poetry which we still know and love today. God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten not made, of one substance with the Father. Through him all things were made. What's striking about that whole theological drama is not simply that it's an example of the church doing its job, drawing out the meaning of divine revelation and teaching it to the world. What is just as striking is just how Greek the whole debate is. From start to finish, none of this would have been possible without Greek dialectic, Greek philosophy, even the niceties of Greek language itself played a key role in the debates and definitions of Nicaea. And all of the people participating in the debate participated in Greek, from Plato to Philo, from Philo to St. Paul to St. Athanasius. I emphasize this story in order to underline the importance of the Greek model, not just for education, not just of education, but also of Greek philosophy and even Greek cosmology, but also the Greek view of knowledge itself and its acquisition of critical thinking, if you like, modern buzzword. It's this very particular tradition of preoccupation with the truth that stands not just at the heart of the educational exercise, but also at the heart of Western man's scientific and technological advance. Faith and reason go hand in hand. In this Hellenic context, then, we see the school of Alexandria, especially under the governance of Clement of Alexandria, proposing what has been called the Christian Paideia, the balanced curriculum that provides what Dorothy L. Sayers famously called the lost tools of learning. Contrary to popular belief, and contrary to the character of it presented centuries later by Bacon and Locke, this education is not divorced from scientific progress, but forms the basis on which scientific progress for the benefit of man becomes a worthwhile and fulfilling exercise. The notion of balance and completeness aimed at in a classical education is part of the Greek ideal and part of the Christian ideal, and it aims at making its students free. In the words of the motto of St. John's College in Maryland, Facio liberos ex liberis libris libraque. I will make free men out of children by means of books and balances. In the ancient Greek world, two main schools of thought existed when it came to education. Citizens were trained in Sparta largely to be unquestioning servants of a one-party state, with a punishing of regime of athletics and military drill which would make them formidable soldiers. In Athens, education, strictly speaking, was about cultivating virtue and wisdom. It was a project interested in individuals rather than in armies. Even in athleticism, it was not just about winning competitions or wars, but rather about seeking beauty, balance, health, and proportion. And so it was that this vision of education as conducted in the Catechetical School of Alexandria, which I like to say was the first Catholic boarding school for boys, and there may have been girls there too, but not in the same building. This education that was conducted in Alexandria, through the spread of Egyptian monasticism, we know that, for example, St. John Cassian, who went to spend 7 years in the desert with Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, they came back to France and spread then the institutes of Cassian and the monastic way of life of the desert, but also this Egyptian synthesis of classical learning in the trivium and the contrivium, and the philosophy and then the theology. So this Saint Benedict, for example, when his monastic organization began, he was a little bit later. The education that he was including in the rule, where he talks about the importance of learning to read, he says, even if you're 50, I'll be 50 this year. He says, even if you're 50, it's worth learning to read. The education that he was giving to the young monks in his monasteries was the trivium and the quadrivium. And when St. Patrick, who's an Englishman or or Welshman perhaps, goes to France then to Auxerre and Tours, to these monasteries that have received the institutes of St. John Cassian and the collations of St. John Cassian and the Alexandrian tradition of the trivium and the quadrivium and so on. He receives that kind of education himself a little bit late in life, because of course he spent his adolescence in Ireland as a slave. And then he stays then catching up on his classical education and his theological education in these French monasteries, and comes back to Ireland when he's about 60, and starts implementing in Ireland a very rigid, strict classical education based also on the trivium and the quadrivium. And so you get in Ireland in the 6th, 7th centuries, monastic schools that are free. Anybody can go to them, sometimes up to 2,000 students, and they're the biggest in Europe. And so when a couple of centuries later, we see in the 800s, Charlemagne in France and Alfred the Great in England, inspired by Gregory the Great's injunction and his encyclical on pastoral care to educate everyone. They say, well, we're going to set up schools for everybody in our kingdoms. So Alfred the Great does that in England. Charlemagne tries to do it in France. Alfred the Great's perhaps a bit more successful. And Charlemagne, interestingly enough, the current thinking is that Alfred the Great had to get Latin scholars from Ireland because the Saxon Latin scholars were so bad. And Charlemagne, he manages to get someone called Clement of Ireland, who became Saint Clement of Ireland, to run his school in Paris, which later became the Sorbonne, which gave free education to boys from all classes. Presumably had an entrance exam in the 800s here. And he has Alcuin then doing the same for him in Aachen, in Aix. And one of the things that Alcuin says to him is, watch out for the influence of those Irish monks. They're all over the place, because he's jealous really of what Clement's doing in the Sorbonne, the palace school in Paris. And what Alcuin doesn't tell you is that he himself was educated in Ireland when he was a boy. And so we have this tradition then of, and this slogan as well, of universal education. And it seems to be very much part of what it means to be a Christian, you know, that we're going to become Christians now. One of the benefits we're going to get from becoming Christians is education. Because don't forget, the guiding principle of Greek education is this search for truth. And just because Christians say they found the truth, what does St. Benedict say in the rule? He says, somebody knocks on the door, wants to come into the monastery, tell him no. Tell him no, tell him no. And then eventually you say, well, look, ask him if he seeks God. And then if he says he seeks God, you can let him in so that he can continue to seek him. So there's this concept of the search for truth continuing then, and a liberal education, or any kind of education, certainly education is something that will help you to discover truth and to learn more truth. We're not saying it's a prerequisite for salvation, but it's one of the benefits of Christianity is to, as Christ said, "Veni ut vitam habeant." I came that they may have life, and life in all its fullness. So the full life which we're promised here on earth, which is meant to be a kind of a foretaste of the full life that we have in heaven, means that we'll be able to do just what the Greeks wanted to do, to fully exploit our intellectual, our physical, our spiritual, creative potential. And that's part of Christianity. You go to anywhere in India or Africa, what's the first thing that these poor people are queuing up for? Is the education they can get from Christianity. It's what they expect the church to dispense. And that's why Pius XI says in the 1920s, the church is mater et magistra. The church is preeminently mother and teacher of the nations. So then about 1200, the Fourth Lateran Council, the influence of all these Irish monks who've kind of gone and saved civilization then, because why has classical civilization and this curriculum of the trivium and quadrivium been damaged in continental Europe? Well, it's been damaged because of war. So although there is this very, very early on, there's an ideal of universal education and education and academic research and the search for truth as part of Christianity, this has been damaged by the wars that are going on in Europe. And of course, Arius, we mentioned Arius before, his followers are still causing problems in the north of Italy, and all the Germanic tribes that are coming, a lot of these people are they're tempted towards Arianism. And one of the things that Charlemagne does, he says to the Pope, listen, make me Holy Roman Emperor and I'll get rid of the Arians for you. And so you need peace. You need peace for education to flourish. And in fact, there was about 15, 16, 17 years of Alfred the Great's reign. And that was really when he'd made peace with the Danes. That was really the time when his educational reforms took off, when there was peace. And it's also why, if you go to England now, they're getting on for several hundred schools that were founded in the first millennium, which still exist in England. You don't get that in any other European country, mainly because England is an island. So it's had, in some ways, less political instability, which is count the Reformation. We'll come on to that in a minute. So the Fourth Lateran Council then, about 1200, we've got Innocent III, who also says education for all. And he makes a specific injunction. He says every cathedral, every religious community, you need to have a school. All the monasteries should start schools. So lots of people talk about the rule of St. Benedict and they say, should we be having a school? It's not necessarily part of monastic life. Well, it didn't come from nowhere. The Pope actually said every religious community should have a school. Every cathedral should have a school. As part of this idea to have universal education. And so through all of this time, the heroes of education, or one of the big heroes really, were the rulers, the good kings, the philosopher kings, if you like, who saw education as a good in itself. They didn't have a second secret motive. They didn't say, well, we're going to teach them how to use computers so that they can get better than the Chinese or whatever. They just said, look, we'll just have education because we know education is good. It's like an asset. We'll have more education and our country will be enriched by it. And it was also an evangelical tool. You can get more education. That's one of the benefits of Christianization. So they believed, rather like the Athenians and the Alexandrians, in the idea of educating citizens. And they believed that this would make their nations stronger, more just, more peaceful, more beautiful. St. Augustine also is somebody who takes on critics of Christians and says, look at the Christians, they're better citizens than the pagans. And so what happens after this, then there's a decline, unfortunately. And, in Europe after, so between the 500s and say the 800s, why did they have to bring in the Irish to help them? Because, there were so many monasteries had been burnt down, manuscripts lost, the tradition of teaching Latin and Greek had been disrupted. And somehow or other, if you've seen Kenneth Clark's Civilization, he has the Skellig Michael, these monks at the extreme north of Europe keep things going. And then they come back then in the 800s. They were missionaries all over the place. Even here in the Vendée, where we are, we had a few Irish saints in the 700s, actually. around here, and we have the relics of one of them from the 700s in the altar of our school. It's called Columbinus, not Columbanus, but Columbinus. So when there were wars in Europe, in continental Europe, states interfered in this flourishing of education in the sense that war brought instability to education, and war therefore had a narrowing effect on the curriculum, that whenever that happened, people thought, well, the essential thing is to be able to read. And that narrowing effect was there. So education was a casualty of war, it wasn't a cause of it. But from about the time of the Reformation, we see education being increasingly instrumentalized, and so that eventually education will itself become the cause of real bloody wars. And that brings to mind perhaps Sparta, for example, where people are bred to be bellicose, or also bred to defend a certain ideology. So why do I say this? The Reformation is this time of change then about what education is all about? Well, okay. Well, we'll just talk a little bit about the Enlightenment, and I might backpedal and talk about the Reformation as well. The curriculum wars that I've referred to in the title of this talk really began in the wake of the Reformation. The Enlightenment, which we call in French le siècle des Lumières, the 17th and 18th centuries, proposed a new worldview, replacing the medieval cosmology, which had held sway in various permutations since the Greeks. And although it began by discussing questions relating to God and man, it ended up revolutionizing philosophy, art, politics as well. There was no established field of the philosophy of education at that time. I think it started after the war. But various Enlightenment thinkers, such as Voltaire and Rousseau, developed views on education which had a profound impact on the curriculum and the methods of education. At the heart of the Enlightenment thinking was the exaltation of reason as a means to emancipate man from all of his sufferings and inconveniences. Reason, it was reasoned, could solve all of our problems. And in the French Revolution, which was the fruit of this movement, what we call the Enlightenment, reason was even worshipped like a goddess on an altar in a church. And then this happened, there was the cult of reason. As we have seen, reason and the search for truth were at the heart of Greek philosophy. The Romans took on and perpetuated this belief in the rational natural order and the natural law which governs man and his environment. But then in the 2nd to 4th centuries, recapping a bit here, the Roman Empire, despite being at its zenith, entered a period of turmoil akin to what we're experiencing today. It was a period of self-doubt, where perhaps the Greek tradition of dialectical questioning was leading to the whole of the Greek world, now under the Roman Empire, to ask deep and existential questions. Also, perhaps a feeling of fragility of the Roman Empire caused people to seek security in eternal verities. In this environment, individual Romans went a step further than the metaphysical speculations of the Greeks. They sought individual salvation for their souls. This climate is well described by St. Augustine in his Confessions. It was the ancient equivalent of the New Age movement. Isis, Mithras, Mani, Epicurus. It was like going to the supermarket and you could choose between all sorts of different religions. And they were all offering a way out from this malaise. But the one which triumphed and seemed to offer the answer to everyone was Christianity, embraced by the emperor in the 4th century and by the elites as well as by the common people. This faith embraced the Greek culture of truth-seeking, but did so under the primacy of revelation. Again, according to the science of the day, you might say something was in the air. Scholasticism, moving on a little bit now, was whose full flowering was in the Summa and other works of Aquinas, clearly put reason center stage. But faith in God and his revelation in Christ was seen as the key to understanding everything else. rather as Frank Sheed does in his book, Theology and Sanity, we can say that belief in God is necessary for a full understanding of man and the world around it. You can see the natural world about you without believing in the sun, but believing in the sun will certainly help you to see better. And not to believe in the sun is, to a certain extent, insane. As the First Vatican Council defined, even if belief in Christ is only possible with the supernatural gift of faith, the existence of God can be arrived at by reason alone. The man hailed as the father of scholasticism explains this primacy of faith in revelation well and famously thus: Neque enim quaero intellegere ut credam, sed credo ut intelligam. I do not seek to understand in order that I may believe, but rather believe in order that I may understand. This faith-seeking understanding lies at the heart of the school and university curriculum, which completely dominated Europe from about 1100 to 1700, even quite substantially after the Reformation. Hundreds of schools and universities founded in the UK during that period still survive. Our arts, our music, our laws, our notion of human rights, of justice, of good and evil, in brief, the foundations of our modern Western culture were laid at this time. Some modern, or should we say postmodern writers have described our culture as born in Greece, catalyzed by Christianity, and purified by the Enlightenment. Well, the chronology is right, but the process of purification, such as it was, turned out to be a curate's egg, good in parts. The seemingly unassailable cosmology and the societal and intellectual system of the Middle Ages were taken by surprise by humanism, by aspects of the Renaissance, and by Luther's Reformation. The government minister and prominent scientist, Sir Francis Bacon, famously challenged the opening of Charterhouse School in 1611 because he opposed its classical curriculum. But it was the Christian humanism of such men, of the men who were founding Charterhouse School, and those before the Reformation who had founded St. Paul's in Westminster, John Colet, which made the experimental investigations of Bacon, Copernicus, and Galileo possible at all. It was the trivium and quadrivium that had laid the ground for the mathematical work of Descartes, of Leibniz, and Newton, who wrote in Latin. Apart from the mathematical aspects of it, one thing one might say led to another. C.S. Lewis, in his book of the same name, calls the worldview that was being cast off by men such as Bacon the discarded image. One striking aspect of the Reformation and of the Enlightenment was the questioning of every kind of authority. Perhaps scholasticism itself had become stifling. Perhaps the discovery of the New World, the birth pangs of capitalism, or something else had sent shockwaves through the old world. Again, there was something in the air, to bring back a phrase I've used a few times. But what exactly needed to be cast off was another question. The figures of the Reformation were divided on the question of curriculum and of liberal learning. Luther was against liberal education. His doctrine of sola scriptura could happily be applied to education as well as to salvation. And yet subsequent Lutherans tended not to follow him on that road. Zwingli shared Luther's suspicion of the pagans. Calvin, on the other hand, and a lot of people are very surprised to hear this, sang the praises of liberal education and thought that intellectual and aesthetic training offered by the pagan authors would make the student more capable of absorbing the truths of the Bible. And he had an opportunity to put this into effect in Geneva because he was in charge. He was a keen proponent of universal education too, in order to give the people direct access to the revealed word of God. Calvinist influence, however, after that was mixed. In terms of popular education, in any case, the Bible dominated, and classical learning was sidelined. In some parts of Calvinism, especially in Scotland famously, they had no time for music or art or literature. The Reformation in England, as I've indicated with the anecdote about Francis Bacon, was still quite traditionally minded in the 17th century. In fact, in England, the education offered in grammar schools changed little during the Enlightenment, except, of course, for the prevailing religious ideologies of the day. On the other hand, with the rise of Deism in the 18th century, the heart was well and truly ripped out of the educational body. If Christ were not God, and God himself were practically disconnected from his creation, then all sorts of assumptions in the medieval system started to be questioned and undermined. As Christopher Hollis has shown in his History of Eton, the public schools, where there was less local supervision, went into a period of decline. I mean, they were unaccountable, that was the main problem. Only reversed a century later by the reforms begun in the mid-19th century by Thomas Arnold, headmaster of Rugby, who, incidentally, if anybody's interested, was a homeschooler. So he started off originally with his wife and his own children and some other children, just sort of teaching them at home. And that's how he kind of developed his theories about being in loco parentis and pastoral care, and how a teacher ought to love the pupils and that sort of thing. He didn't actually have a doctorate. He was given a doctorate just because he was made headmaster of Rugby School. It was sort of automatic. And he was a bit of a liberal theologically to start with, but eventually he became an evangelical who did believe in the divinity of Christ, which was against the prevailing mood amongst ecclesiastical elites in the Church of England at the time. Anyway, the development of scientific methodology, the inductive method, and at the same time, the conviction that all of our existence might be governed by a set of physical laws which could be discovered by researchers, this all had a sapping effect on the motivation of Christianity and the motivation of Christians, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world. This was really the explanation behind a wide abandonment of belief in the divinity of Christ among many members of the clergy in the established church in England. And certainly at the moment when the United States of America began, that was the prevailing orthodoxy amongst Anglican ecclesiastics, was Deism. Perhaps less so on the continent, but even so, especially in France, this was also the case amongst Catholic priests. Everyone was turning to Deism. And it was in this context that Freemasonry was also born and flourished. It was this movement of rationalism and its religious creed of Deism that led, which was very much an elitist religion. I mean, the ordinary working man doesn't find much comfort from a God who just winds up the world clock and then walks away from it. This Deism ultimately led to atheism and the materialism characterized by the French Revolution. Later led, one can argue, to communism and to Nazism and to, in a certain way, to modern capitalism. But events of the mid-20th century onwards have so surely shown, atheism in turn turns into godlessness and materialism into a sad cycle of ennui, envy, and lawlessness, such as we're seeing today. Enlightenment thinkers developed new theories of ethics and human psychology, independent from divine revelation. The English philosopher John Locke, I'll give you his date, 1632, 1704, proposed that the human mind was a tabula rasa, clean slate, on which experience would write the different character of each man according to accidental circumstances. The goodness of man, which Shakespeare calls his nature, and the original sin, which St. Augustine will tell us disfigures that nature, were displaced and made irrelevant by this new teaching, which denied original sin. Augustine had proposed that the city of man should be modeled on the city of God, the heavenly Jerusalem. But now it was all about pragmatism, as Rousseau would call it later, a social contract. The air was ripe with thoughts of revolution, I should say. Perhaps a better society could be created on rational lines. Two most famous intellectuals of the French Enlightenment are Rousseau and Voltaire. and they both had important and strongly held views on education. There were differences and similarities. Both were the product of the strict and systematized version of classical education developed by the Jesuits in the 1590s and set out in the document the Ratio Studiorum. While obvious products of it, of that Jesuit education, and beneficiaries of its broad scope, both disapproved of the education they had received. Rousseau vacillated between the Calvinism of his birth and the Catholicism of his Jesuit education, but ultimately did not see religion as about personal salvation. Rousseau, in his Emile ou l'Éducation, took up Locke's theme of a child born in total innocence. For Rousseau, a liberal education was an evil which ended up making people bad. Education was evil. That's what Rousseau thought. Left to his own devices, he thought, a child would simply learn what he needed for himself. The ideal type, which Rousseau aimed at, was the simple, hard-working, honest Savoyard peasant. So Emile had a tutor, this imaginary boy in the book, but the tutor did nothing but arrange experiences for him, such as taking away the food so that Emile could learn what it was to be hungry, for example. But he would do so without corrupting the boy or forcing him to learn any particular thing. It was the birth of experiential, child-centered learning, but it was not really tested at the time, least of all by Rousseau himself, who confided his own illegitimate offspring to the very Jesuits he so much despised. Voltaire was also hostile to the influence of the Jesuits and argued for a program of education administered totally by the state. Since Sparta, no one had really had such an idea. Voltaire, on the other hand, was a great lover of the Greeks, and in terms of the curriculum, he was an enthusiast for the trivium and the quadrivium. The goddess Reason replaced theology as queen of the sciences, but otherwise, the essential elements remained in his vision of education. So the state education as proposed by Voltaire was the same education he had received, with God taken out. Voltaire incidentally died screaming for the priest. He maintained a chaplain in his house, but did not confess to him. When, on what seemed to be his deathbed, he called in the priest and confessed his sins, but rallied and did not die. So a few days later, he gathered his friends and remonstrated with them. If this happens again, he says, don't let me be a coward. Promise me that you'll not call for a confessor. A short time later, he died, screaming for the priest. So to put that out, a bit of human tragic story in there. Anyone who's seen the film, The Mission, or read the book by Robert Bolt will know something of how the Jesuits operated in the New World, building model communities which anticipated 3 centuries ahead of their time the Catholic social teaching of 20th century popes. The film also portrays very vividly the way in which the Jesuit order was in constant danger of suppression. Driven by the Marquis of Pombal, Portugal's domineering prime minister, the anti-Jesuit movement among Europe's elites, who all resented papal influence in politics, did actually lead to the complete abolition of the Jesuits in 1773. Don't forget, the Jesuits were the main educators in France. And so what happened to all of their schools? They were converted into secular institutions. In some other countries, they just closed, but in France, where they had the biggest influence, they were all secularized in 1773. And the Jesuit order itself wasn't resurrected again until 1814. And most of the Jesuits who'd been there in 1773 were dead. Anyway, the intellectual edifice of classical learning, together with its machinery, was turned into a system of promotion for Enlightenment rationalism. Now, Voltaire and Rousseau were now either old or about to die by this point, but Voltaire would have been very happy with what had happened. Rousseau less so, because he thought education was evil, and this is a powerful educational system now being harnessed by the revolution. So it was no surprise then that by the time the French Revolution happened in 1789, because the French Revolution hadn't quite happened yet, don't forget. So we've got 16 years between the suppression of the Jesuits and the French Revolution. Of course, one thing leads to another in some ways. France's clergy and schools, after 16 years of secularized education of their elites, are already full of Freemasons and rationalists, eager to throw off the Roman yoke. The ordinary people, however, not the bourgeoisie. I mean, when I say the elites, I mean the urban bourgeoisie, some of the aristocracy, but often the clergy came from the urban bourgeoisie often. So the ordinary people still maintain their affection for religion, as was seen in various uprisings against the revolution, particularly in the Vendée subsequently. Their education was a bit different. It had been dispensed in primary schools founded by Saint John Baptiste de La Salle, who died in 1719. De La Salle pioneered a system based on the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, dividing boys, especially boys, into 3 groups, beginning with the inepti, the inept, and ending with the perfecti. And you would move up between the groups. Work was marked, points were given out of 20, same as in modern French schools, and progression up through the system was only allowed when the learning outcomes were demonstrably met. So you could read up, you could do the year again, or you could go up to the next class, depending on your results. And there were only 3 classes. The Enlightenment was finally killed off at the guillotine. As the Renaissance Pope's excesses backfired and led arguably to Luther's excesses and his Reformation, so did the bloodlust of the revolutionaries. It meant that their revolution was doomed, at least in the form that they had envisioned. The religion of the deists didn't work, it didn't please the people, and so, of course, Napoleon came back and effectively reinstituted a different monarchy and made peace with the church. Of course, there was lots of fallout, but that was the basic thing that happened. Part of the reason why the American Revolution gave no clue of how awful the subsequent French Revolution would be was that English-speaking deists were not reacting against anything. They certainly weren't reacting against Rome. That had happened centuries before. They had just drifted into heresy. It was not tinged with politics. There wasn't any appetite to get rid of the king. That experiment had already been tried and failed with Oliver Cromwell. Even in America, the first instinct of the colonialist was not to form a republic, but to ask Washington to become king. But Washington, just like most of his friends and the clergy he knew, were deists and Freemasons, just as is increasingly the case, as I've said, in France. After the American Revolution, many English intellectuals were sympathetic to the French Revolution. Wordsworth was in France in 1789, for example, and was thrilled by everything that was happening. Oh, to be young, and in France in 1789. As Dickens puts it in The Tale of Two Cities, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. But the politician Edmund Burke, along with most of the other English political and literary establishment, were horrified by the terror when it happened. Intellectuals in droves who'd been moony about the revolution now deserted the revolution in droves. The response was Romanticism, a slap in the face to rationalism, if there ever was one. And through Romanticism, the spirit of the Middle Ages, a positive feeling towards the old faith and all it stood for, slowly made its way back into the public consciousness. Think of all the Gothic architecture that started to happen in the 19th century, for a start. As various waves of intellectual conversions also occurred between, we'll say, 1850 and 1950. So we come then to this 19th century when the theory of evolution, the expansion of empire, the advance of technology, the movement of people, the rapid growth of populations, and all of these things bring about an appetite for change. But they also are destabilizing. There's something in the air. People are uneasy. In England, in the teeth of the deism of the elites, religious revival had been brought to the working classes by John Wesley throughout the 1700s. He died in 1791. And now it was time for another voice to bring back their rulers to a belief in the divinity of Christ. Don't forget, the established church in England, and also by extension in America, wasn't really Christian in any sense of the word because of this widespread deism. And that voice came from Oxford. It was the voice of Keble, Pusey, and later of Newman. And it swept the country like wildfire. The decay in the public school system in England, I've mentioned, down to a lack of energy, motivation, caused by this deism, really. At Eton as elsewhere, outward forms had survived, but the core was dead. The reforms at Rugby, carried out by Dr. Thomas Arnold, were a great success, notably in the broadening of the curriculum from merely Latin and Greek to include more serious study of maths, plus history and geography, which was he invented really as a school subject, and also the restoring of sport and athletics, particularly team sport, to a place in the curriculum rather than sort of disapproved of extracurricular pastime. Arnold's masters, almost all low church evangelical clergymen, were also given the pastoral care of their boys, and in many ways, in Anglican clothing, this was a return to what these institutions had stood for in the late Middle Ages: godliness and good learning. But it was Newman who, getting to grips with something very important, attempted a kind of synthesis of the great English educational tradition of its song schools and its grammar schools, tradition stretching back unbroken to the 6th century. He recognized in that tradition a kind of genius, an ethos which was worth defending. There was, he thought, something in the air, or at least something in the stones, all these medieval buildings. And so it was that when others sought to found schools in 19th century England, what did they do? They made them look like medieval monasteries. Famously, Nathaniel Woodard, who died in 1891, founded Lancing College. And his motivation was to save the middle classes from irreligion. That was really, he was a simple Anglican vicar. Managed to raise a lot of money, and the chapel of Lancing College is the largest school chapel in the world, and it looks like it was built in 1400s. The reforms of quality driven by Dr. Thomas Arnold and his son Matthew Arnold, the first English chief inspector of schools, were successful in restoring something resembling a classical education to all the public schools. There's any Americans out there, that means private schools, and to the grammar schools, even to the new grammar schools, which were being set up in the 19th century, and copying the public schools in most things, including their externals, particularly in trying to look old and medieval. Primary education was already focused on the ability to read the Bible, and even before national schools were created at the end of the 19th century, it's now been demonstrated that the majority of English children could read, couldn't necessarily write comfortably, but they could read the Bible. There was a brief attempt to make military drill compulsory in state primary schools too at the end of the 19th century, in imitation of the Prussians and the Spartans. But this was a disaster and quickly abandoned. The education which survived in English schools until very recently still bore the hallmarks of the early education acts: compulsory religious instruction, a daily act of worship, right up till very recently. And in fact, the daily act of worship is still compulsory, and so is religious education. The priorities were clear, or at least officially clear, or at least, as with many English things, the outward appearances of something don't change, even if the interior reality does. And so we need to talk a bit about another current in education, and that's the progressive one. It divides sort of into two fields, two branches. There's a progressive approach when it comes to content, and there's a progressive approach when it comes to method, right? And so this is really at the time of 1900, something like that, la pédagogie nouvelle, that's what it's called. Both of these approaches, progressive approach of content and of method, were more or less condemned by Pius XI in his encyclical Divini Aelius Magistri. But in the end, Pius XI himself admits that good teachers are more important than good systems. And so the church came to accept the feasibility of some aspects of the pedagogies of Miriam Montessori and of Baden Powell. Pius XI himself became enthusiastic about the Scouts, for example, even though they are very much child-centered and experiential. Even if the naturalism and such currents of thought which could deny original sin, that was roundly condemned. John Dewey in the States also promoted a style of pedagogy which was very child-centered and in which teachers were more facilitators of learning than instructors. Of course, in his experimental school, all the children were nice children, So of course it worked for them. More importantly, springing from the ideas of Rousseau expressed in Emile ou l'Éducation, we can see a movement in the post-war period and culminating in the 60s and 70s, which sees traditional curriculum content as evil, just like Rousseau did, and or at least optional. Such ideas were promoted by figures such as Piaget, who claimed falsely that you couldn't teach difficult things to young children, because he invented a series of stages, conceptual stages. Of course, that had the effect of various things that you couldn't teach children anymore, because it was against the rules of Piaget's developmental stages. Carl Rogers, who promoted values clarification and therapy for normals, which meant you couldn't teach children ethics in the same way anymore. There was no content. Deconstruction. So the idea was that they had to arrive at their own knowledge. And unlike the Socratic method, where you know what you want to teach them, in this case, there's no right answer. So that was Rogerian methods. And then more recently, someone called Pierre Bourdieu, who had this concept called restricted code, where he talks about language and culture as a way of excluding people from different classes. So the idea was that this restricted code ideology, if you like, it perpetuates the class system and keeps the working classes down. That's basically what he says. And as a result of that, there was this movement then to get rid of this bourgeois content from education. When we say bourgeois content, we mean books, Shakespeare, difficult maths, learning French, Latin, what have you. In the UK, up until the reforms of Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, teachers were progressively abandoning vast parts of the traditional curriculum. This was also happening in the United States. And of course, it was also the Common Core in the United States accelerated this, because it said that all we need is maths and English, mainly maths. But so teachers were progressively abandoning vast parts of the traditional curriculum, motivated by a particular mixture of political and atheistic motives, and increasingly simply because the left-wing media had allowed such revolutionary ideas to become received wisdom. So that, for example, when a Labour education minister said teachers should be teaching children, not subjects, everybody thought, yeah, that sounds so great, There were schools in the 70s and 80s where children didn't have to learn to read. This is in England I'm talking about, if they didn't want to. My mother taught in a school like that in Southampton in 1980. She wasn't only criticised for being more ambitious than the other teachers for her pupils, she was criticised by the head teacher for wearing a skirt to work. In Greater London, as part of the positive imaging policy, traditional school subjects were replaced with left-wing ideology. There was no national curriculum, so they were able to do this. Challenging bourgeois culture, heterosexuality, and whiteness. Even in the traditional school subjects, there was an effort to portray homosexuals, women, and ethnic minorities positively, and everyone else negatively. It was a kind of payback time. So, if you were learning French, a little boy would have to chat up another little boy in French and ask him out for a date. And then, in the maths problems, there would be, two women who lived together and had children, and they would be adding up their grocery bill for the week. And so the idea was that the whole curriculum was just completely permeated with this political correctness, as we called it at the time. And copies of the Danish book, Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin, were translated to English and provided to every primary school in the Greater London area, so that all the children could be brainwashed into this new idea of families. And it was in this context that Mrs. Thatcher abolished ILEA, the Indian London Education Authority, and the GLC, Greater London Council, and made it illegal under Section 28, which until 2003 prohibited the promotion of homosexuality by schools and other organizations financed by local government and taxpayers' money. Now, why was that necessary? Why did they even come onto the agenda? Because there was a curriculum war going on. There was a curriculum war going on, and it's still going on. That law was repealed in 2003, and there's another one that's replaced it more recently. Now, schools are obliged to teach this sort of thing in the curriculum, but of course, the way they do so depends on each individual school. When I was 16, my religion teacher, which I had, it was a private school, told me he'd resigned from teaching in an Ilia-controlled school in the borough of Haringey because he began to feel uncomfortable with the results of positive imaging. At the end of year disco for 16-year-olds, boys were dancing with boys and girls were dancing with girls. He had attended similar events in schools just a few years before, and things had been quite different. The children, he thought, were at best not being well prepared for life in the outside world, and at worst being brainwashed by him into a parallel reality, the sexualized playground of the progressive left. But the brainwashing is back again, I'm afraid to say, as you may have read in the papers. A BBC documentary, not a documentary, an education program to be shown in schools, which claimed that there were at least 100 genders, was recently withdrawn due to complaints, which at least shows that when parents do find out what's happening in schools, they don't like it. Then there was the notorious case of Anderton Primary School in Birmingham, where one parent recently said of the protests against the promotion of LGBT lifestyles to young children, "You can expect these protests all over the country. If we give in, this is the beginning of something, not the end. If we give in, well, we just can't give in." Perhaps they give in, but they shouldn't. The national curriculum in the UK was first opposed by teachers, this is back in the 1980s, and is now accepted. Until Michael Gove took over in education a few years ago, the content had been constantly dumbed down, been less ambitious even than what was proposed in the 80s, with grade inflation and an overall experience of the lowest common denominator. In academic terms, the abolition of what might be called Mickey Mouse subjects for the curriculum, like general studies, critical thinking, thinking skills, applied science, i.e. not content-free science, these subjects have gone. And the upping of the grade boundaries in mathematics and the sciences, especially at A-level, well, all of that is to be welcomed. On the other hand, the battle isn't over. Since Gove, and a lot of those things are to do with the fact that there's this ideology now of idolatry even towards STEM, science, technology, engineering, maths. This is the only thing that matters. So that's a danger. And it's also allowed something to go undetected, that there's a big problem in the humanities as they're being taught in the UK now. In modern languages, the peddling of the LGBT agenda is stifling, especially for someone who studies several modern languages at A-level, which is the situation we've had here a few times, where we've had boys who've done French, Spanish, and German A-level. And this means that not only do you have to learn the languages, but you have to learn societal themes. And marks are given not just for your ability to talk about these themes, but also for the content. You have to be able to talk about these things as if you thought about them and learned about them at school. So in France, you have to learn about different kinds of family and also about gay rights. And if you're studying Spanish, you have to learn about LGBTQ rights. You also have to learn about women's rights. And you also have to learn about the stranglehold of the church on Spanish society. So in the German curriculum, it's not quite so bad. As long as you can talk about gay marriage, that's fine. But if you've got those three languages, instead of learning, the literature of those cultures or the history of those countries, for example, you're spending all your time being brainwashed, and you know how to talk about these things. That in fact, if you get into a conversation with someone in any of these countries when you go and visit, these are not subjects that you're typically discussing, probably. These subjects are being instrumentalized in the same way that religious education, any kind of problem to do with sex education, they give it to the RE teacher. Now in modern languages have become a dump for this kind of rubbish. How is our education system fulfilling its responsibilities to LGBTQ and environmentalism? Oh, it's happening in the modern languages curriculum. For some reason, it's worse in Spanish. I don't know. In history and English literature, the new assessment objectives, the way they mark papers, have sapped the subject of all interest in life. They're now merely exercises in deconstructive box ticking. And as a result, it's being taught in an uninspiring way, often by people who just have no culture. Sorry to say. The system is reaping its own fruits, The numbers taking English literature are dropping annually, drastically. The teaching of Latin is surviving, but it's become a marker of social class. Greek is disappearing fast, and if there are no statistics for Greek anymore, there aren't enough entries for exams to give statistics. The Conservative Manifesto pledge of about 20 years ago to ensure that all children are taught to sing in unison and in tune never happened. How difficult would that be? Not very difficult at all. In general, the picture over the last 20 years has been that the best place to get something resembling a classic education is in the private sector. There are exceptions, but they're almost all schools that, although they're in the maintained sector, one needs to be rich enough to buy a house in their catchment area in order to go to them. Some of the other exceptions would be free schools, such as the Nicaea school, for example, Catherine Barber saying famously, which is it seems to be a great school. There are a number of other schools that are very popular with ethnic minorities who are ambitious for their children, who are another thing about in London schools now, of course, the ethnic minorities are in the vast majority, even if you look at the statistics, and they're quite happy learning education in Michaela school that's based on Western culture. Anyway, another important aspect of the curriculum which we haven't tackled is sport. I'll just mention a couple of things about that. I'm a strong defender of the role of sport in schools. A few different definitions, perhaps I ought to mention. First, there's a distinction between athletics and athleticism on the one hand, and team sports, team games on the other. Arnold in rugby in the middle of the 19th century, he promoted team games, but not particularly athletics. The ancient Greeks promoted athletics, but not particularly team games. St. Clement of Alexandria, in his school, in the early church, the boys certainly were taught gymnastics and competed at running. They wore shorts. He mentions that in one of his books. Team games were, however, seen to be an unofficial amusement. They weren't part of the curriculum. In the Middle Ages, team games came to dominate, the running races existing. By the 18th century in England, many schools discouraged sport or forbade it altogether. In Eton, for example, in the 18th century, if you did anything sporty, you'd be beaten for risking. There's one exception. They were allowed to beat a ram to death. That was the one thing that they used to do in Eton. And on one occasion, they hamstrung it. They cut its tendons. They ran across the bridge into Windsor because this ram still managed to run very fast. And then they caught the ram. They chased it all the way back to the school across the bridge. And this was about 1800. And all the boys in the school were beaten by the headmaster, not for being horrible to animals, but for putting their health at risk of overheating because they'd gone running. So some funny ideas about school sport exist at various points. And I think it's important to teach team games, important lessons from them. We should stand up for them. We should make sure they aren't sidelined. We should also make sure that they're not turned into Mickey Mouse sport, where there isn't proper competition, there isn't a proper game happening. Athleticism is a good thing too, as long as we can avoid the excessive competition that leads even to drug use in schools. That's happening in the UK, even now. Schoolboy sport's been affected by drug use. Or an obsession with body image, which can be another problem. Or also an obsession with athletics that takes kids away from other activities. A recent feature of education policy has been that in any country that allows high levels of parental choice, the demand from parents tends to be for a more realist and constructivist kind of school and a content-rich curriculum. So a realist school is where we're teaching real subjects and you can test them and they've got that knowledge that you've given to them. You've transmitted the culture to them. The constructivist idea of education is when you say, well, just try and teach yourself and arrive at some knowledge and, you build your own knowledge kind of thing. Parents don't like that if you give them the choice. And the thinking amongst academics is also shifting, but as it does so, it raises the ire of the hard left, the cultural Marxists, if you like, the people whose, in the same way as, in Russia and in China and so on, there was this idea of destroying the culture that was there before that had oppressed people, We're hearing it all the time now. Got to get rid of this culture that oppresses people. It's linked to slavery, white men, etc., etc. So that's kind of coming back. But if you remember a few years ago, this Catherine Beerboss thing I mentioned, who founded the Nicaea School in London, she spoke at a Labour Party conference about a return to back to basics sort of approach, and she was shown the door, even though she was a Labour supporter, maybe no Labour member, I don't know. And subsequently, she founded her own free school and hasn't looked back since. The great defender of teaching traditional content as opposed to skills in recent years has been E.D. Hirsch Jr., who is a big shot in America, but has also had some influence in England, has influenced also some of the thinking of Gove, for example. And he has called in his book Cultural Literacy for a return to a common language of literature, history, geography, cultural references that will enable our divided society to speak together in a language that we'll all understand. That was also the largely unheard plea of the philosopher Raymond Williams back in the 70s, who was very much a socialist in his culture and society. Michael Young, a leading light of the Institute of Education in the 1970s and a disciple of Pierre Bourdieu, he of the restricted code that supposedly excludes the proletariat. For decades, Young campaigned against a curriculum rich with the content of dead white males, but then he changed his mind and became a supporter of Michael Gove. With his own children going through school, he began to see that this did not work. He also realized another thing is he went to South Africa. His wife is South African. He went to South Africa, and there was a kind of a free-for-all constructivist curriculum to do with values and citizenship and so on, which was supposed to be there in the schools. The teachers were completely hopeless and they didn't know what to do. And so it was a complete disaster because there weren't clear learning outcomes. And so he talks about this and explains why he changed his mind. He also realized that instead of demolishing the cultural edifice of Western culture because it might exclude people, which is the sort of line of Pierre Bourdieu, we need instead to open up that edifice to everybody and not allow language and culture to be something that excludes people, but actually bring people into that culture. And he calls this powerful knowledge. And he's gone back to something that any poor African or Indian parent will tell you for nothing. The acquisition of knowledge is already a kind of emancipation. So he still has some left-wing ideas, but the other thing is you need to watch what he's going to put in the content, but at least he's in favor of teaching challenging content in schools. But as a very, very important person in education, Michael Young. But under the surface of what men like Young are saying is an ongoing threat to the curriculum. One of his colleagues, John White, who also at the Institute of Education, also a kind of disciple of Bourdieu and these kind of people, he's given way on curriculum, and you know, you can have some Shakespeare, you can have some classical music if you like, but the religion of environmentalism and the ideology of gender, the progressive secular sexual ethics, they all need to find their way into the compulsory content of this shared curriculum. And you get to a situation then where, in order to participate in the national discourse, to be part of society, you have to have this common culture. You have to have that teaching, even if we're talking about quite controversial, politically correct stuff. Now the national curriculum is going to come back to bite us because this will be made compulsory. Howard Gardner, the man who gave us the multiple intelligences, do you remember kinesthetic learning, auditive learner, this kind of thing, has also moved to the right. In Truth, Beauty and Goodness Reframed, which was published a couple of years ago, he calls for a return to the three transcendentals of Plato, which formed the basis of that kind of Greek education we were talking about, and for a return to the classics which have shaped our civilization. Like the ancients, he sees this now as an imperative in an age when vast technological advancement and relativistic attitudes towards human nature have deeply shaken our moral worldview. We don't know what right and wrong are anymore. For him, a return to classical education could bring about a return to virtue. Meanwhile, E.D. Hirsch, in his Why Knowledge Matters, Rescuing Our Children from Failed Educational Theories, which was published last year, shows that the reforms of Lionel Jospin in France in the 1980s, which led to what the French call la crise de l'école, which is the primary school crisis. And at that time, don't forget, the UK was more moving towards a tougher curriculum, and actually a national curriculum. But in France, they were saying, well, we're going to need to teach skills, not content. And this move towards skills rather than content has had a drastic negative effect on literacy and numeracy in French schools. And because the French are so good at keeping written records of everything, now there is empirical proof that the reforms of Lionel Jospin in primary schools have caused children to be illiterate and enumerate. And what has the French government done now? They've made education compulsory from age 3 to try and make up for the fact that when you go at 5, it's not soon enough because the education is so bad. So they're kind of covering themselves. And now it's extending into the college, into the secondary school, the same kind of damaging approach. But people are starting to question it now. The same thing's happening in the secondary schools, this move from content to skills. And Hirsch warns against this, using the French data based on something called PISA scores, which is objective scores of people's literacy, numeracy, and so on, which we have from most countries in the world. In the UK and the US, the received wisdom has recently become that we need to teach skills, not content. So it's kind of swings and roundabouts. France has realized something's gone wrong. In the UK, we haven't quite realized it yet, you know. But Hirsch shows that even aside from its cultural benefits, the traditional content imparts skills anyway. If you study literature, if you study history, if you study those subjects, mathematics, you will gain critical skills and thinking skills and analytical skills just by accessing the material. You don't have to be taught critical skills, critical thinking as a subject. Is someone saying thank you there? Yeah, I'm nearly finished now, but I will make a recording of this available because I've recorded it. So if anybody wants a recording, you can access it later. So a group of conservative thinkers on education who knew very well those on the left, Bourdieu, Bernstein, Young, White, etc., but disagreed with them at the time in the 70s, are now coming back into vogue. These people like Peters, Hurst, Oakeshott, great philosopher, conservative philosopher. These are men who defended the canon, although some of them were on the left politically. Hurst, for example. The ideas of Piaget, Rogers, Bourdieu, Dewey as well, and so on, they're still being peddled in teacher training courses, but their influence is on the wane. On the whole, teachers want to do a good job, and those who remain in the profession are now getting better and better at it. The grassroots feeling among teachers is that they want to teach content and teach it well. Education gurus like Doug Lemov, I found out about recently, and other sort of super teachers are attracting cult followings on the internet and on Twitter and so on. These people are calling for a return to culture, and teachers are aware that it's skipped a generation. So they're filling in the gaps in their knowledge in order to teach it more convincingly to the young. So there are plenty of signs of hope. But there's also the danger that education is the football of politicians. I'm confident that if ordinary people get to decide about the curriculum, they'll make the right choices. But as long as liberal elites do the choosing, they will not help this cause. They want to keep the masses obsessed with trivia so that we leave them alone to enrich themselves as they watch our civilization self-destruct, like Nero fiddling while Rome burned. Europe is at a difficult moment. The cultural achievement which I've mentioned above, which came from Europe, is now in a very bad state. What built Europe was that devotion to universal education for education's sake. Education should be intransitive, not transitive, i.e. children should learn like a flower grows, full stop. They shouldn't learn to do something, so that's a good thing as well, but that's not what education is about. The battle for content has been more or less won in our schools, content as over skills. We just need to make sure now that we're getting the right content and that our schools are not being instrumentalized to brainwash our children into something which might be grandly called British values, but which in the end is value-free. The Italian senator and philosopher Marcello Pera wrote a book in 2008 called Why We Should Call Ourselves Christians. Although an atheist, he'd come to see that Christianity is at the root of everything we hold dear in our society, and that we cannot afford to lose touch with that root. Benedict XVI, who became Marcello Pera's friend, called for Europeans to act as if they believed in God, even if they no longer did. More and more intellectuals, many moving from a position of hard atheism, are beginning to think along these lines. Islamic fundamentalism, rampant materialism, the disintegration of the family, all of these things are beginning to concentrate the mind. Although Thatcher's approach was a bit ham-fisted, this kind of attitude, similar to that of Marcello Pera, was present in the conservative education policy of the 1980s. But the nation wasn't ready for it then. It was still half living in its loony left la-la land. But people are starting to wake up now. We need now, I hope it's not too late, but this is my last couple of thoughts now, another 2 minutes. We need now more than ever to fight for the transmission of our Western culture to our young. And not just the culture, but a love of that culture. That needs to be one of our learning objectives. We need to ensure that the education we transmit is, according to the desires expressed by Vatican II's Grossum Educationis, wide, deep, and of quality. It needs to oppose what John Paul II called the segmentation of knowledge. We know more and more about less and less. We need to communicate a worldview. And that worldview, whether we are Christians or not, needs to be a Christian worldview. The worldview that we communicate in Western education needs to be a Christian worldview, whether we're Christians or not. For that is who we are. That is where we've come from. To give our children something other than their rightful inheritance is like giving a child a stone when he asks for bread. To cut our children off from this great conversation that has forged our civilization would be to make them orphans. So when our grandchildren ask us, children, what did you do in the curriculum war, Daddy? Well, I hope I've given you some ideas that it's a battle that hasn't stopped and it's worth fighting. You know, it's a battle that we can all fight in our own patch, and I encourage you to do so. Thank you. I've gone on for quite a long time, but if anybody has just for 4 or 5 minutes as some comments or questions, they'd be very welcome.
I have to say, when you mentioned Carl Rogers, I started getting horrific flashbacks.
You know him.
He taught the Immaculate Heart nuns who taught me in 2nd grade, and as a result, they went utterly insane. So
were they Immaculate Heart of Mary nuns?
The very same. IHMs stood for I Hate Men, he said. But
so I had a conversation once with Carl Rogers' assistant. I think he's dead now, Coulson.
Yes.
And I was interviewing him for an article, and they had were not only promoting therapy for children in schools, but therapy for entire religious orders, including the IHM nuns.
Yep.
And they did this values clarification, and of course the result of it was that most of them left their religious life.
It was amazing, and of course they reflected that while they were teaching us, because they were going through their own interior dramas, which they wanted to share. So at one point I make the second point, specifically with regard to American education, is the utter collapse in the teaching of history, certainly on the secondary level, which is something I've come to know very well over the past few years. And it is universal. I had the experience of going to the place where Franklin Roosevelt died in Georgia, now a state facility, as in the state of Georgia. And I found that they no longer give out audio guides to the museum there, because the schools in Georgia no longer go there because they no longer teach about Franklin Roosevelt. I said, well, wait a minute, they don't teach about Franklin Roosevelt, I asked the ranger, then they're not teaching about the Depression or World War II. He says, no, they're not. So that led me to an important question, I think, which is, well, if they're not teaching them that, what are they teaching?
What are they teaching? Yeah. Well, in English schools, we get an awful lot of World War II. I mean, that's the main thing that we get. I mean, France is actually very strong on. I mean, France has historically been very strong on history, and this is one of the things about the very programmatic approach of the French Éducation nationale, that it's sort of been frozen in time for the last 2 centuries. Of course, it's been slightly dumbed down in terms of the level, no doubt, but the idea that when you go to secondary school, you start with the ancient world, then the Middle Ages, and the Industrial Revolution in the 20th century, and so on. Children are able to situate themselves in time and space quite well, whereas English children, it's all thematic often, so they can't remember which thing happened first. You know, it must be the same in the States, I guess. Thematic.
Yeah. And it's very scarce. Same in Germany, I understand. I'll tell you that when Jospin, you mentioned, came in, I remember reading his educational proposals in the Los Angeles Times, and he was saying how he found the American system an inspiration because it was so much more creative. And I read that. All right, great.
I mean, the craziest thing about this is, just imagine in the French Revolution, if the revolutionaries and Napoleon had decided to implement the educational philosophy of Rousseau instead of Voltaire. What would have happened then?
A very different European history, I expect.
But the crazy thing is that we in America and in England, we picked Rousseau up very late in the day, and he's sort of been a god in education for the last couple of generations.
Oh. Sad.
We have somebody from. Are you from Portugal or Brazil, Mr. Barroca?
I'm from Portugal, but I'm the head of science in an all-girls Catholic school in London called Marymount. You might be aware of.
And, yes, Marymount. Yes.
Yes.
Very good.
And thank you so much for wonderful, let's say, lecture here. We don't hear often in the Catholic sector, in the independent sector, from people that share your views, which are definitely my views, and especially in an international baccalaureate school where you know, the Piaget pedagogy that is skill-centered is king. It's definitely really refreshing to see that the teaching the right curriculum, the right content-centered curriculum is very important. That's exactly where I stand. So this was very refreshing.
Thank you. It's a thing about the international baccalaureate that it has gathered a lot of prestige in France now. People are very impressed by it for some reason, but the breadth of the different subjects and so on is just characterized by 2 things: lack of depth and political correctness.
Definitely what you were talking about, the religion of environmentalism, that's definitely one of the aspects of it. There is definitely, well, I mean, there is depth, but I only know the sciences, really. That's what I teach. But yeah, the overarching theme of environmentalism is very entrenched. It's remarkable.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. I recently sort of, perhaps this is a bit lowbrow, but I'd recently been introduced to a reality TV show, the premise of which was to bring a group of GCSE students to a school which had been made up to look like a school either from the 1950s or the 1960s. And one of the series that I watched put them into effectively a reconstructed secondary modern school. And I found that very interesting because what I noted was that the boys, when they were separated in their practical lessons, they really enjoyed it. And I wondered, you know, do you think that such practical, very hands-on education has a place in modern education now, even though it's sort of been pushed out and seen as sort of throwing away potential almost these days?
Now, when you're saying practical hands-on stuff, what do you mean? Woodwork or science experiments?
Yes, so they would actually have like bricklaying classes and like classes they would literally go and work on a car and learn how to fix a car straight off.
The problem is that I'm not against that, but it's not education. It's very good and everyone should do it, you know. I mean, I remember there was you remember Ronald Runcie, Archbishop of Canterbury? Yeah, he was a great knitter. There's nothing wrong with having these. I mean, I think it possibly in a boarding school, particularly, or in a school that's, you know, why not have those activities alongside as well? But they shouldn't replace education.
I see what you mean. Okay, that makes sense.
But I do think that they can be, to use a modern word, channeling. I think it's quite good for boys to do stuff that's hands-on, sure, but I mean, I would be cagey about. I think boys are also very good at being intellectual and asking questions, and my fear would be. It's a difficult debate for society, but society ought to say, well, look, everybody. There's an idea of accessing the curriculum. We should basically be able to say that we've got something to transmit to the young, and they all should be able to access this canon that we're transmitting to them. And it might be that some of them will be university professors and some of them will be plumbers, but the point of education is to transmit that patrimony. But I think that, you know, even boys and girls who are super duper intellectual, you know, they should be learning pottery and woodwork as well if you can fit it into the curriculum. But you can't do everything. And one of the problems of the modern curriculum is it ends up doing everything and nothing. So
that makes sense, yeah.
But I mean, I think it's, and the other thing as well is the idea that it's not unclassical to learn in that way. You know, I mean, there is this idea of le réel, the real, that education ought to be connected to the world. You know, that it shouldn't be completely cerebral. I mean, we are body and soul and spirit, and we should. So I think that's something that needs to be got to grips with. You know, I mean, for example, my mother was teaching in that school in Southampton where there were children of 9 and 10 years old who couldn't read, and she was told not to bother to teach them to read. They were in Southampton, and those children hadn't seen the sea. This is 1980.
How can you live in Southampton and not see the sea?
Well, I mean, it just wasn't on their estate, you know.
Everywhere you look is the estuary.
So, I mean, that's an even more basic thing. But I mean, I would say that how can you understand a poem? How can you know? So they went to the sea. They didn't get in it, but my mother organised a trip to the sea, and they just walked up and down the beach and looked at shells and had a lovely time. But there were 5 or 6 kids in the class who'd never seen the sea.
Building on your inquiry, Josie, in my own experience, I did a graphic products GCSE, which was great on an extracurricular level, but I did it in preference to Latin because I had to make the choice. I couldn't do both. There was no room on my timetable, and that was the way it went. And a fool as I was at the age of 15, making my choices, and that was the way it went.
I mean, of course, one way that we could do all of this stuff and do it well and do more of it is to learn faster.
Well, perhaps.
You know? Well, a lot of education is sort of very much drawn out, you know, from between the age of 5 and 18. I mean, there are a lot of subjects that you know, if they were taught better, you probably could accelerate them, particularly something like maths. I
mean, I did find actually, I'm taking a languages degree at the moment, French and Russian, and I'm taking the Russian from scratch. And what really impressed me was the level that they were able to get my cohort up to, starting from knowing practically no Russian at all to, you know, being able to read probably news articles and understanding the gist of what they were saying within a year. And, you know, comparing this to my secondary school French education, where they were taking in people who, again, probably might not have known any French, might have done a bit of French. And, you know, you got to the end of GCSEs and some people probably wouldn't have been able to string a sentence together at the end of it still. And you just wonder whether they couldn't, you know, I mean, granted, they do have fewer contact hours than you can do with a degree, but, you know, you don't wonder whether they could try and cram in a bit more.
I bet they taught you the Russian at university in a more grammatical way. And you learnt
Definitely, yes.
languages at school, because that's the way to do it quickly, is to actually put the building blocks in there, and then you can learn the rest more easily.
Oh yes, definitely.
Has anybody else got anything else? Maybe we ought to go off and have dinner.
I just wanted to add one final comment. You talked about the languages at A level and being used as a sort of a means of indoctrination.
Yes.
Well, since not taking Latin at GCSE, I encounter Latin every day. I'm part 2 music student, and most of my papers that I'm studying are medieval. So I'm doing Latin all the time and struggling. So I thought I'd do some practice in my spare time, and I was using Duolingo. And early on, I came across many a sentence along the lines of femina uxorum habet.
Oh yes.
And just every single question is, you know, so it's not just the modern languages that they're
the ancient ones as well.
Yeah.
Okay, well, listen, unless someone else has got something to throw into the pot, thank you everybody for coming and for listening very carefully to my ramblings. And I'll send a link to you if anybody wants to share this afterwards, because I've recorded it. God bless. Have a good Lent.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.